It was supposed to be a simple briefing. May 12, 1968. The conference room at Military Assistance Command Vietnam Headquarters in Long Binh hummed with air conditioning that couldn't quite overcome the heat rising from 47 men packed into a space designed for 30. American officers from the 173rd Airborne Brigade, Australian liaison personnel, intelligence analysts with maps they'd been studying for 3 straight days. Everyone knew what was coming. Everyone knew it was bad. But when the briefing officer pulled the cover off the topographical map, the silence that followed wasn't professional attention. It was the kind of silence that precedes a flat refusal. The target area lay 20 kilometers north of Bien Hoa, directly astride the main infiltration route the North Vietnamese were using to funnel troops and supplies toward Saigon. Intelligence estimates placed enemy strength at regimental level, possibly 2 regiments. Conservative estimates put the number at 3,000 North Vietnamese regulars. Aggressive estimates doubled that figure. The mission was to insert a task force, establish fire support bases, and interdict enemy withdrawal after the failed Tet Offensive. An American colonel was the first to speak. His exact words would be recorded in 3 separate after-action reports and redacted from 2 of them. "Gentlemen, this is suicide." He was not being dramatic. In the 3 months since Tet, 5 separate American operations had attempted to operate in similar terrain against similar enemy concentrations. Combined casualties exceeded 400 killed and 1,100 wounded. Enemy body counts were impressive on paper, but the Americans kept getting mauled in the process. The proposed operation would put Australian and American forces directly into the meat grinder, deliberately establishing bases on enemy supply routes and waiting for them to attack. It violated every principle of maneuver warfare. It invited exactly the kind of conventional battle the North Vietnamese wanted, where their numerical superiority could overwhelm Allied firepower. 3 American commanders declined the mission in that room, not because of cowardice, because the mathematics didn't work, because sending men into a trap you've identified as a trap isn't tactics, it's sacrifice. The Australians said yes, not enthusiastically, not naively. The Australian Task Force commander, Brigadier Ron Hughes, understood exactly what he was committing his men to. He had one condition. The Australian SAS would go in first. They'd spend a week conducting reconnaissance patrols through the target area. They'd identify enemy positions, map defensive installations, locate headquarters elements. By the time the main force flew in to establish Fire Support Base Coral, the Australians would know exactly where the North Vietnamese were, exactly how many, and exactly how to hit them. The American officers nodded. That made sense. That was smart planning. What they didn't understand, couldn't understand until they witnessed it, was that the Australian SAS operated under principles so fundamentally different from American special operations that the 2 forces might as well have been fighting different wars entirely. The mission that followed would become the Battle of Coral Balmoral. It would last 26 days. It would involve over 70,000 troops from multiple nations. It would result in one of the largest, bloodiest, and most sustained engagements Australian forces had fought since World War II. And it would all begin with something the Americans called impossible: inserting 5-man reconnaissance teams into the middle of an enemy regiment and keeping them there, undetected, for a week. The North Vietnamese called the Australian SAS Ma Rung, the Jungle Ghosts. By the time Coral Balmoral ended, the Americans would understand why. The Australian approach to special operations in Vietnam had developed along a path completely separate from American doctrine, and the divergence showed in ways both subtle and stark. Where American Special Forces emphasized rapid insertion, aggressive patrolling, and overwhelming firepower, the Australian SAS operated on principles that seemed almost prehistoric by comparison. Slow movement, absolute silence, patience measured in days rather than hours, and a willingness to endure conditions that most Western soldiers would consider unbearable. The first SAS patrol inserted for the Coral Balmoral reconnaissance departed Nui Dat at 0300 hours on May 6, 1968. 5 men. Sergeant Michael Mick Connor leading, Corporal Terry Walsh as second in command. 3 troopers whose names remain classified to this day for operational security reasons that persist 50 years later. Their equipment load was precisely calculated: weapons, ammunition, water for 3 days, concentrated rations, medical supplies, radio with spare batteries. Total weight per man, 35 kilograms. No tents, no sleeping bags, no changes of clothing, nothing that might make noise or leave trace evidence of their passage. The insertion itself demonstrated the difference in methodology. American LRRP teams typically inserted by helicopter directly into their area of operations, accepting the risk of detection in exchange for speed and surprise. The Australian SAS walked. Connor's patrol traveled 8 kilometers on foot through friendly territory before crossing into the target zone. They moved at 100 meters per hour, not as a precaution, as standard operating procedure. To understand how 100 meters per hour works requires understanding how it doesn't work. A Western soldier trained in conventional infantry tactics moves through jungle at perhaps 2 or 3 kilometers per hour, depending on terrain. This creates noise, branches snap, vegetation rustles, equipment clatters, breathing becomes audible. The human presence announces itself through 100 different signatures that predators and prey both recognize instinctively. At 100 meters per hour, none of that happens. The point man takes a single step, plants his foot with surgical precision on ground, tested for stability and sound, freezes. The entire patrol freezes. For 4 minutes, 5 men become part of the landscape. They scan their surroundings using only their eyes. They test the air with subtle movements of the nose and mouth, reading scent. They listen with an intensity that seems almost supernatural. They process every sound the jungle produces, cataloging it, learning its rhythms. After 4 minutes, another step, another freeze, another 4 minutes of absolute stillness. This is not tactics. This is transformation. The jungle soundscape operates on predictable patterns. Birds call, insects drone, monkeys chatter, vegetation rustles in the wind. Any disruption to these patterns signals intrusion. Any predator or prey that wants to survive learns to recognize the disruption instantly. At 100 meters per hour, the Australian SAS created no disruption. The jungle continued its normal operations around them because, from the jungle's perspective, they weren't there. Connor's patrol covered 8 kilometers in the first 24 hours. They established their first observation post overlooking a trail intersection at 0430 hours on May 7th. And there they stopped. For 31 hours, those 5 men occupied a position less than 50 meters from a trail that North Vietnamese troops used hourly. They watched. They recorded. They documented every movement, every unit designation visible on uniforms, every weapon type, every supply load carried past their position. The North Vietnamese never knew they were there. On the second day, 2 enemy soldiers stopped for a cigarette break less than 15 meters from the Australian position. One sat down on a fallen log, looked directly toward where Connor lay concealed behind a screen of vegetation so thin it wouldn't hide a man from 10 meters away. The enemy soldier studied the jungle, scanning for threats with the wariness of someone who'd survived ambushes before. His eyes passed over Connor's position 3 times. He saw nothing unusual, because there was nothing unusual to see. Connor had achieved something that Western military training struggles to replicate. He had stopped generating behavioral signals entirely. Most people, even trained soldiers, maintain a constant low-level activity even when motionless. Micro-movements of the eyes, subtle shifts in breathing, the unconscious adjustments of posture that the body makes to maintain comfort. These movements are invisible to casual observation, but visible to careful observation, especially to careful observation from close range. Connor had eliminated all of it. For 31 hours, through heat, insects, thirst, physical discomfort that approached torture, he and his patrol existed in a state that resembled deep meditation more than tactical operation. They became absent, and in that absence they became invisible. This was the foundation of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam. Not superior equipment, not better weapons, not technological advantage, psychological transformation so complete that human beings could occupy space without announcing their presence. It was a capability developed through selection and training processes so demanding that only 1 in 12 candidates completed the course, and it was a capability that no amount of American firepower could replicate. The transformation began long before Vietnam. Australian SAS selection took place over 3 weeks of physical and psychological testing that deliberately pushed candidates past normal human limits, not to test strength or endurance alone, to identify men who could endure the intolerable without breaking, who could maintain cognitive function under conditions that induced hallucination in normal individuals who possessed what psychologists called predatory patience. The final test of selection involved a 48-hour tracking exercise through bushland where candidates hunted each other using techniques that had never been written down. These weren't tactics from military manuals. They were skills passed from Aboriginal trackers who'd been integrated into Australian military operations since the 1950s, men whose ancestors had survived in some of Earth's most demanding environments for 40,000 years by developing capabilities that Western science still struggles to explain. Aboriginal tracker Sergeant Billy Naylon had taught Australian SAS operators how to read ground disturbed by human passage, not just footprints, the compression patterns that indicated whether someone was moving cautiously or casually, carrying weight or traveling light, injured or healthy, alert or relaxed. He could determine from a single footprint how long ago it had been made, within a margin of hours, by reading moisture content in disturbed soil and vegetation. American forces had tracking schools. They taught soldiers to follow obvious sign, broken branches, disturbed ground, visible footprints. Aboriginal tracking operated on a completely different level. It was reading the landscape the way literate people read books, extracting information from details so subtle they seemed invisible until someone demonstrated what to look for. Australian SAS operators learned to track by first learning to move without leaving sign. They practiced walking through scrubland for hours while instructors examined their path afterward, identifying every trace of passage. A bent grass stem here, a disturbed pebble there, soil compressed in patterns that indicated human foot rather than animal hoof. The training was relentless, repetitive, focused on eliminating signatures one at a time until movement became genuinely traceless. This wasn't traditional military training. This was something closer to apprenticeship in crafts that predate written history, and it produced results that couldn't be taught through classroom instruction or field manuals. It required immersion, practice, failure, correction, and repetition until behaviors became automatic. By the time SAS operators deployed to Vietnam, they'd internalized techniques that made them functionally invisible to enemy forces, not through camouflage or concealment technology, through elimination of the behavioral signatures that human beings normally generate when moving through terrain, the ability to exist without announcing existence. But achieving invisibility was only the first requirement. The second requirement was surviving what happened when invisibility failed. The morning of May 12, 1968, began with routine so mundane it lulled even experienced soldiers into complacency. Fire Support Base Coral was being established by helicopter insertion starting at 0600 hours. Elements of 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 102 Field Battery, elements of 3rd Cavalry Regiment, with armored personnel carriers, engineers, signals personnel. By mid-afternoon, approximately 800 men had been inserted into a clearing carved from the jungle by hasty bulldozer work. The position was incomplete. Defensive perimeters weren't finished. Artillery hadn't registered all defensive fire targets. Communication trenches remained shallow. Some units were still organizing their equipment when the sun set at 1830 hours. Australian doctrine called for 24 hours minimum to establish a proper fire support base. They'd had 12. Mick Connor's patrol, still occupying their observation post 4 kilometers north of Coral, watched enemy movement increase throughout the afternoon. Small groups became larger groups. Individuals became squads. Squads became platoons. By 1600 hours, Connor had identified elements of 3 different North Vietnamese battalions moving through the area, all heading south, all heading toward the incomplete Australian base. He transmitted a situation report at 1630 hours. Message received and acknowledged by Task Force Headquarters. The information was processed, analyzed, and filed. No additional defensive measures were implemented at Coral. The position was already as prepared as time permitted. They'd be ready, or they wouldn't. Adding more last-minute adjustments would just create confusion. At 0330 hours on May 13th, the North Vietnamese 141st Regiment attacked Fire Support Base Coral with 3 infantry battalions supported by mortars and rockets. The bombardment lasted 4 minutes. Then 800 North Vietnamese soldiers assaulted the Australian perimeter from 2 directions simultaneously. What followed was chaos of the kind that reveals who has been properly trained and who has not. The mortar platoon position was overrun in the first 5 minutes. 1 of 102 Battery 6 howitzers was captured. Enemy troops penetrated 50 meters into the Australian defensive perimeter before being stopped by concentrated fire from machine guns and the remaining artillery pieces firing over open sights at point-blank range. The Australians held, barely. 11 men killed in the first hour, 28 wounded. Enemy bodies littered the approaches to the base, but blood trails and drag marks indicated many more casualties had been evacuated during the assault. The North Vietnamese withdrew at 0630 hours, leaving the Australians in possession of a position that had come within minutes of being completely overrun. Connor's patrol watched the entire engagement from their observation post 4 kilometers away. They could hear the artillery. They could see illumination rounds turning night into flickering day. They could monitor the increasingly desperate radio traffic as Australian units called for fire support, medical evacuation, ammunition resupply, and they could do nothing, because their mission was reconnaissance, not direct action, because revealing their position would compromise their ability to provide the intelligence that might prevent the next attack from succeeding. So they stayed. They watched, and they waited for the North Vietnamese to make another attempt. The second assault on Fire Support Base Coral came at 0230 hours on May 16th. This time, the North Vietnamese committed a full regiment, approximately 2,000 soldiers attacking from 3 directions with heavy mortar and rocket support. The Australians now had additional defensive positions completed, including bunkers for the artillery and improved fighting positions for the infantry. They also had armored personnel carriers from A Squadron, 3rd Cavalry Regiment, which proved decisive in stopping the assault. The battle lasted 4 hours. 5 more Australians killed, 19 wounded. The North Vietnamese left 34 bodies on the battlefield, but again, the blood trails indicated losses far exceeding what could be confirmed by body count. The assault failed, but only through the kind of desperate fighting that can't be sustained indefinitely. The Australians were bleeding. The question was whether they'd bleed out before the North Vietnamese gave up. What the Australians needed was not more firepower. They had artillery support from multiple batteries, helicopter gunships on call, tactical air support available on short notice. What they needed was intelligence, precise, detailed intelligence about where the North Vietnamese were concentrating for the next assault, where their command elements were positioned, where ammunition and supplies were being staged. The kind of intelligence that could only come from eyes-on-target observation. Mick Connor's patrol had been in position for 9 days. They'd been without resupply for 6 days. Water was nearly exhausted. Rations were gone. They'd supplemented with water collected from vegetation and whatever edible plants they could identify. Connor himself had lost 8 kilograms of body weight. The youngest trooper on the patrol was showing early signs of heat exhaustion despite remaining motionless for 18 hours a day in positions protected from direct sun. Connor requested extraction. The request was denied. The message from Task Force Headquarters was succinct. Intelligence indicates enemy preparing major assault next 24 to 48 hours. Your position essential to defensive planning. Resupply impossible without compromising location. Can you continue? Connor's response would become legendary within Australian SAS circles, quoted in training exercises and operational planning sessions for decades afterward. Can continue. Send whiskey when this is done. For 3 more days, that patrol remained in position. 72 additional hours of absolute stillness, watching North Vietnamese troops prepare for what would be their final major assault on the Australian fire support bases. Connor documented the assembly of a full regiment in positions less than 2 kilometers from Fire Support Base Balmoral, which had been established on May 24th as a second strongpoint supporting Coral. The intelligence Connor provided was so detailed, so precise, that Australian artillery could pre-register fire missions on assembly areas, approach routes, and probable attack positions before the assault began. When the North Vietnamese hit Balmoral At 02:30 hours on May 26th, they ran into defensive fires so devastating that the assault collapsed in less than an hour. 6 Australians wounded, 42 confirmed North Vietnamese killed, with prisoner interrogations later suggesting total casualties exceeded 200. The jungle ghosts had made the difference, not through direct action, through pure reconnaissance executed with a level of patience and professionalism that even elite American units struggled to replicate. But Coral Balmoral was not the most dangerous mission the Australian SAS undertook in Vietnam. It was simply the most documented. The missions that tested the absolute limits of what special operations personnel could endure remained classified for decades, and some remain classified still. In October 1968, 6 months after Coral Balmoral, an intelligence officer at MOCV headquarters in Saigon received a request that made him believe someone was playing an elaborate joke. The request came from Australian sources. It proposed inserting SAS patrols into the Longhai Mountains, a 14-kilometer limestone massif southeast of the Australian base at Nui Dat. The problem was, the Longhai Mountains weren't a proposed operational area. They were off-limits, explicitly forbidden to American ground forces by direct order from Military Assistance Command Vietnam. The reason for this prohibition was straightforward. American units that entered the Longhai never came out the same way they went in. In March 1967, a company from the 173rd Airborne Brigade, 47 paratroopers, had conducted a sweep through the eastern approaches to the mountain complex. 72 hours later, 19 men walked out. The other 28 had vanished, not killed by ambush, not captured in firefights, simply disappeared. Their bodies were never recovered. Their fates remained unknown. They'd been hunted methodically, patiently, one by one, and pulled from their patrol formations without a single shot being fired that their fellow soldiers heard. The Viet Cong's D-445 Provincial Mobile Battalion operated from tunnel complexes inside the Longhai that had been expanded and fortified for over 20 years. They knew every cave, every tunnel entrance, every concealed position. They'd survived American B-52 strikes that dropped 40,000 tons of ordnance on the massif between 1966 and 1968. They'd repelled 3 major marine operations, and they'd done it by using the terrain itself as a weapon, disappearing into tunnel networks so extensive that even intensive ground operations couldn't locate them. MACV Command had solved the problem by declaring the Longhai off-limits and drawing a red boundary on operational maps. American forces would not enter. The Viet Cong could have their mountain fortress. The cost of taking it was too high. The Australians offered to go where the Americans wouldn't. Not to take the Longhai, to map it, to identify tunnel entrances, supply routes, command posts, defensive positions, to spend weeks inside the Forbidden Zone conducting reconnaissance that would make it possible to neutralize D-445 without committing ground forces to a meat grinder. The American response was predictable. Absolutely not. Too dangerous. Too likely to result in the same fate that had befallen previous patrols. The intelligence value wasn't worth the probable casualties. The Australians went anyway, not as an official operation, as what later documents would describe as independent reconnaissance in support of task force operations. Plausible deniability for the Americans if it went wrong. Full operational authority for the Australians if it went right. Between October 1968 and February 1969, Australian SAS conducted 17 long-range reconnaissance patrols into the Longhai Mountains. Each patrol lasted between 15 and 21 days. The intelligence they gathered filled over 3,000 pages of classified reports and included detailed maps of 43 separate tunnel entrances, locations of 6 different command posts, identification of supply routes used to move weapons and ammunition from coastal delivery points to inland operational areas. More significantly, their presence inside what D445 had considered secure territory produced effects that no amount of bombing could achieve. The Viet Cong began seeing ghosts. Sentries reported movement that left no trace. Guards heard sounds that shouldn't exist. Patrols found evidence of intrusion that made no sense according to any tactical doctrine they understood. Soldiers began disappearing from positions that should have been secure, their throats cut in the night without alerting sentries positioned 15 meters away. Captured documents from this period reveal a unit descending into collective paranoia. D445's operational logs record increasing restrictions on movement, defensive postures replacing offensive operations, and explicit requests for reinforcements to deal with an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't fight. By December 1968, D445 had effectively ceased offensive operations, not because their strength was reduced, not because supplies were inadequate, because their will had been broken by an enemy that operated according to rules they couldn't comprehend. One Australian patrol spent 19 days inside the Longhai without once being detected by the Viet Cong. They occupied observation posts within 50 meters of active tunnel entrances. They documented enemy movements, photographed installations, recorded conversations they could overhear from concealed positions. When they finally extracted, they left behind calling cards, not propaganda materials, physical evidence that someone had been there all along. A playing card, the ace of spades, placed on a sleeping mat inside a tunnel entrance, a ration tin from Australian supplies left in a command post, boot prints in mud that matched no footwear the Viet Cong had seen before, leading from nowhere to nowhere and disappearing without explanation. The psychological effect was devastating. These weren't just ghosts. These were ghosts that left evidence of their presence specifically to demonstrate that they could operate with impunity inside positions the Viet Cong considered impregnable. The message was clear. Nowhere was safe. No position was secure. The jungle belonged to the hunters, not the hunted. The psychological warfare doctrine employed by Australian SAS went far beyond simple intimidation. It was calculated manipulation of cultural fears specific to Vietnamese peasant soldiers. The ace of spades, for instance, wasn't selected randomly. In Vietnamese folklore and French colonial interpretation of Vietnamese symbolism, the spade represented death and misfortune. French colonizers had used the card as a psychological weapon decades earlier. The Australians refined the technique, but the cards were only one element. Australian SAS operators studied captured Viet Cong documents, interrogation reports, and intelligence assessments to understand how enemy soldiers thought about combat, death, and supernatural forces. Many Viet Cong fighters came from rural villages where belief in forest spirits remained strong despite communist political education that discouraged superstition. The Australians exploited this. They arranged enemy bodies in positions that suggested supernatural intervention rather than conventional combat. A Viet Cong soldier found sitting upright against a tree, eyes open, weapon across his lap, no visible wounds, created questions that comrades couldn't answer using military logic. Had he been killed by poison? by some silent weapon that left no trace, by forces that couldn't be explained. In one documented incident from November 1968, an Australian SAS patrol infiltrated a Viet Cong base camp while the occupants slept. They didn't attack. They rearranged equipment, moved weapons from one position to another, left footprints that led into the camp from one direction and out from a completely different direction without any connecting path between them, took food supplies from storage areas and distributed them to different locations throughout the camp. When the Viet Cong woke, they found evidence that someone had moved through their secure base camp without alerting sentries, without leaving coherent trail, without taking anything of military value, just rearranging things, demonstrating that penetration had occurred. The psychological impact exceeded any ambush. It meant their security measures were worthless. It meant the enemy could come and go at will. It meant nowhere was safe. Captured documents from the unit affected by this operation revealed declining combat effectiveness over the following 2 months. Soldiers refused night guard duty. Patrols moved in larger groups than tactically necessary because men feared being separated from their comrades. Offensive operations were postponed or canceled because units couldn't maintain the discipline necessary for aggressive patrolling. This was psychological warfare at a level American forces rarely attempted, not because they lacked the capability, because it required patience, cultural understanding, and willingness to conduct operations that produced no measurable results in terms of body count or captured equipment. The effects were real, but invisible to metrics that military bureaucracies used to assess performance. But the most dangerous Australian SAS operation in Vietnam wasn't in the Longhai. It wasn't at Coral Balmoral. It was something that officially never happened at all. In January 1969, my CV-SOG command received intelligence suggesting that a North Vietnamese divisional headquarters had been established in a heavily fortified base area just across the Cambodian border, approximately 15 kilometers west of the South Vietnamese provincial capital of Tay Ninh. The intelligence was solid. The problem was, Cambodia was neutral territory. American forces were prohibited from conducting cross-border operations. Officially prohibited. Practically, MACVSOG ran operations into Cambodia regularly. But those operations were small-scale, highly deniable, conducted by American personnel who could be disavowed if captured. A divisional headquarters represented a target too valuable to ignore and too sensitive to attack with conventional forces. It required reconnaissance, detailed reconnaissance, the kind that required eyes on target for extended periods. American MACV-SOG teams typically spent 3 to 5 days on reconnaissance missions into Cambodia or Laos before extracting. The risk of compromise increased exponentially with time on target. Someone at MACVSOG Command suggested the Australians. The suggestion was apparently made half-jokingly, an acknowledgement that if anyone could survive the mission, it would be Australian SAS. The joke became operational. Planning became classified orders that didn't exist in any official documentation. 2 Australian SAS patrols, 5 men each, inserted into Cambodia in late January 1969. Not by helicopter. They walked across the border from Vietnamese territory, traveling through terrain so dense that helicopter insertion would have been impossible anyway. They moved at their standard 100 meters per hour. They carried supplies for 21 days, though the mission parameters called for 14-day reconnaissance with extraction on day 15. What those patrols found exceeded intelligence estimates by a factor of 3. Not a divisional headquarters, a corps-level command post, not one regiment. Elements of 3 different divisions, North Vietnamese Army regulars, not Viet Cong irregulars. A concentration of enemy forces preparing for what would become the 1969 Tet Offensive, the second major assault on Saigon and provincial capitals throughout South Vietnam. The patrols should have extracted immediately. They'd found the target. They'd gathered intelligence. Standard operating procedure was to transmit the information and withdraw before enemy counter-reconnaissance could locate them. Both patrol leaders made the same decision independently. They stayed. For 27 days, those 10 Australians operated inside a heavily defended North Vietnamese base area, documenting troop movements, identifying unit designations, mapping defensive installations, photographing supply operations. They were never detected, not once, despite operating within a perimeter defended by thousands of North Vietnamese soldiers trained specifically in counter-reconnaissance operations. The daily routine of deep reconnaissance at this level tested human endurance in ways that conventional operations never approached. Each patrol occupied observation posts for periods of 18 to 20 hours per day. During those hours, they remained absolutely motionless, not shifting position to relieve cramping muscles, not adjusting equipment that created pressure points, not moving to maintain circulation in limbs that went numb from sustained immobility. They urinated and defecated without leaving their positions, using techniques that prevented scent signatures. They ate concentrated rations that produced minimal waste and could be consumed without noise. They drank water so sparingly that some patrol members showed signs of dehydration by the second week, accepting reduced cognitive function as the price of operational security. Insects were a constant torture. Mosquitoes, ants, leeches, spiders. Normal response to insect bites involves movement, scratching, brushing away, adjusting clothing. Australian SAS operators learned to suppress these responses entirely. A leech attaching to an arm or leg would feed until it dropped off naturally, sometimes hours later. Ants could crawl across exposed skin without triggering any reaction. Mosquitoes bit unchallenged because the motion required to prevent or stop biting would create disturbance visible to observers. One trooper reported in a declassified debriefing that he'd counted 73 separate insect bites over a 72-hour period occupying an observation post during the Cambodia reconnaissance. He'd reacted to none of them. The interviewing officer asked how he'd managed it. The trooper's response was simple. You don't think about it. You just accept it's happening and focus on the job. This level of physical discomfort, combined with the psychological stress of operating inside enemy territory for weeks, created conditions that broke normal soldiers. Australian SAS operators didn't just endure it. They maintained perfect operational discipline throughout. They made no mistakes. They compromised no positions. They gathered intelligence with precision that suggested they were operating in controlled conditions rather than behind enemy lines. The photography alone represented technical achievement that bordered on impossible. Military cameras of that era were bulky, required careful handling, produced audible clicks when the shutter operated. Taking photographs from concealed positions 50 meters from enemy installations without detection required timing each shot to coincide with natural sounds that would mask the camera noise. A bird call, wind through bamboo, distant artillery fire. One patrol spent 4 days documenting a North Vietnamese supply depot, taking over 200 photographs that captured enough detail to identify specific weapon types, ammunition quantities, and logistical patterns. The film was extracted by helicopter pickup 15 kilometers from the patrol's position, requiring a night march through terrain they couldn't reconnoiter in advance. The patrol made the movement in complete darkness, without night vision equipment, relying entirely on feel and the kind of terrain awareness that comes from spending weeks moving at 100 meters per hour. Every photograph in that collection showed sharp focus, proper exposure, and framing that captured maximum intelligence value. This wasn't amateur documentation. This was professional intelligence gathering executed under conditions that should have made it impossible. The intelligence they provided was so detailed that when the 1969 Tet Offensive launched, Allied forces were waiting, not surprised, not scrambling to respond, waiting, pre-positioned to interdict supply routes, strike command posts, ambush withdrawal routes. The offensive failed catastrophically. North Vietnamese casualties exceeded 10,000 in the first week. The political objective, demonstrating that Allied forces couldn't provide security, collapsed when South Vietnamese cities that had burned in 1968 remained secure in 1969. The two Australian patrols extracted on day 28, walking back across the border into South Vietnam without incident. Both patrol leaders submitted identical requests in their after-action reports, official commendations for their teams. The requests were denied because officially the mission never happened. Because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging cross-border operations that violated Cambodian neutrality. Because the political cost of exposure exceeded the value of recognizing extraordinary performance. The patrols received nothing, no medals, no official recognition, not even inclusion in unit histories that documented other operations from the same time period. The men involved were bound by secrecy agreements that prevented them from discussing the mission for decades. Some never spoke about it at all, even after classification periods expired. This was the reality of being the soldiers who took the missions everyone else called suicide. You succeeded in silence. You received nothing for succeeding, and you lived with the knowledge that everything you'd accomplished would be denied by the institutions that had ordered you to accomplish it. The Australian approach to special operations in Vietnam produced results that couldn't be disputed but couldn't be replicated. Kill ratios of approximately 500 to 1. Casualty rates so low they seemed statistically impossible. Reconnaissance intelligence so detailed it enabled defensive operations that bordered on precognition. Psychological effects on enemy forces that exceeded anything American firepower achieved. The methods that produced these results were available for anyone to learn. Australian SAS personnel trained American LRRP schools. They shared techniques with MACVSOG operators. They published detailed after-action reports that documented exactly how they achieved invisibility, how they sustained operations for weeks without resupply, how they transformed jungle terrain from obstacle into weapon. American forces studied the reports, attended the training, acknowledged the effectiveness, and then continued operating according to American doctrine that emphasized speed, firepower, and technology over patience, fieldcraft, and adaptation. The disconnect was cultural, not tactical. American military culture valued action, aggression, and visible results. Australian SAS culture valued patience, invisibility, and results that couldn't be photographed or quantified. American soldiers were taught to impose their will on the environment. Australian SAS operators were taught to become part of the environment until the distinction disappeared. The difference showed in combat. American LRRP teams that attempted to replicate Australian techniques typically lasted 3 or 4 days before compromise forced extraction. Not because they lacked skill, because they lacked the psychological transformation that made 21-day reconnaissance patrols possible. They could learn to move slowly. They couldn't learn to exist in the state of absolute presence that eliminated behavioral signals entirely. The fundamental difference lay in what each military culture considered acceptable. American Special Operations doctrine, influenced by decades of conventional warfare success, viewed the soldier as an active agent who controlled circumstances through superior firepower, better equipment, and aggressive tactics. The Australian SAS approach inverted this completely. The operator became passive, allowing circumstances to unfold around him while he observed without interfering. This passivity was psychological torture for soldiers trained in aggressive action. American LRRP team members reported in debriefings that the hardest part of attempting Australian-style operations wasn't physical discomfort. It was suppressing the urge to act, to respond, to impose control over situations that felt increasingly threatening. The longer they remained passive observers, the stronger the psychological pressure to abandon the observation post and either extract or engage. Australian SAS operators described the experience differently. They didn't fight the urge to act. They entered a mental state where the urge didn't exist. Multiple veterans used almost identical language in post-service interviews. You stop being a person doing a job and become the job itself. The distinction between observer and observation disappeared. They existed in pure sensory awareness without the normal operations of human consciousness. Western psychology has limited frameworks for understanding this state. The closest analogies come from meditation practices in Eastern traditions or flow states reported by athletes and artists. But those comparisons fail to capture the sustained duration and extreme conditions under which Australian SAS operators maintain this awareness, not hours, days, sometimes weeks, while dehydrated, physically exhausted, surrounded by enemy forces, under constant threat of detection. The neurological changes this produced were measurable. Studies conducted on Australian SAS veterans in the 1980s showed altered baseline cortisol levels, changes in amygdala response to perceived threats, and modifications to default mode network activity that persisted decades after service ended. These weren't symptoms of trauma. They were adaptations that had become permanent features of nervous system function. Some veterans described these changes as disabilities that prevented normal civilian adjustment. Others viewed them as capabilities that had value beyond military applications. One former SAS operator who became a commercial pilot reported that the hypervigilance and threat detection skills he'd developed in Vietnam made him exceptionally effective at identifying potential mechanical failures and weather hazards. Another who transitioned into emergency medicine said the ability to maintain cognitive function under extreme stress directly translated to performance in trauma situations. But many struggled. The same mental state that made them invisible in jungle reconnaissance made them aliens in suburban civilian life. They couldn't turn off the constant environmental scanning. They couldn't stop processing every sound, every movement, every change in their surroundings as potential threat data. They couldn't reintegrate the sense of self they'd learned to suppress in operational environments. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian SAS Vietnam veterans exceeded 60% in longitudinal studies conducted through the 1990s and 2000s. This compared to approximately 30% among American Special Forces veterans and 20% among conventional infantry veterans. The correlation wasn't with combat intensity. Many Australian SAS operators saw less direct combat than their American counterparts. The correlation was with duration of sustained hypervigilance and psychological suppression required by their operational methods. The cost of invisibility was measured in decades of difficult civilian reintegration, in relationships that failed because emotional accessibility required by intimacy conflicted with emotional suppression, required by operations in careers that never developed because the transformation that made someone an effective jungle operator made them ineffective at tasks requiring normal social interaction. This was the price, not just during service, for life. The transformation that made 21-day reconnaissance missions possible wasn't something that could be reversed when the mission ended. It was permanent modification of how human consciousness operated, purchased in the interest of operational effectiveness, and never compensated by the institutions that demanded it. The men who mastered this transformation paid for it, not just during operations, afterward. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans exceeded American rates, despite smaller numbers and lower casualty figures. The ability to exist in that state of hypervigilance couldn't be switched off when operations ended. It persisted for years, sometimes decades. Some veterans never fully returned from the psychological space they'd inhabited in the jungle, but the missions got done. The impossible became routine. The suicidal became survivable. 5-man patrols operated for weeks inside enemy-controlled territory and came home alive. Intelligence that conventional operations couldn't gather was documented in detail that made the difference between defensive success and catastrophic failure. Psychological operations that terrorized enemy forces into paralysis were conducted without firing a shot. This was the legacy the Australian SAS left in Vietnam, not the highest body counts, not the most decorated soldiers, not the operations that made headlines, the missions nobody else would take, the reconnaissance that saved lives by preventing battles rather than winning them, the psychological warfare that broke enemy will without breaking international law, the professionalism that succeeded in silence and received nothing for succeeding except the knowledge that it had mattered. When the last Australian SAS patrol extracted from Vietnam in October 1971, they left behind something that couldn't be measured in body counts or captured territory. They left the knowledge that special operations didn't require overwhelming force or technological superiority. They required transformation. They required becoming what the mission demanded, regardless of cost. They required accepting that effectiveness and recognition rarely coincided. The North Vietnamese called them Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts. The name persisted long after Australian forces withdrew, passed down through Viet Cong and North Vietnamese units as a warning about enemies that operated according to rules that made no sense according to conventional doctrine. Decades after the war ended, Vietnamese veterans still spoke of the Australians with a mix of respect and superstition that they afforded no other Allied force. The Americans called them something else. The soldiers who took the missions everyone else called suicide, and survived them, not through luck, not through superior equipment, through transformation so complete that they stopped being soldiers in any conventional sense and became something the jungle itself couldn't distinguish from its own rhythms. The Pentagon eventually learned the lessons the Australians had demonstrated, eventually integrated patient reconnaissance into special operations doctrine, eventually acknowledged that invisibility could achieve results that firepower couldn't replicate. But it took decades, and the Australians who pioneered the methods received nothing for their innovation except the knowledge that their successors would benefit from lessons learned in blood and silence. Mick Connor retired from Australian military service in 1974. He never spoke publicly about his 12 days observing North Vietnamese positions before Coral Balmoral. He never discussed the Longhai operations. He never confirmed or denied participation in cross-border reconnaissance into Cambodia. When asked about his service by researchers compiling official histories, he provided dates, unit assignments, and operational areas. Nothing more. He died in 2008, age 67, from complications related to exposure to Agent Orange. His funeral was attended by 14 men who'd served with him in Vietnam. They stood silent at the graveside, did not speak about their service, and dispersed immediately after the ceremony concluded. None gave interviews, none provided statements for the public record. The only acknowledgement of Connor's contribution came from a handwritten note included with his military records. He did what others wouldn't. He survived what others couldn't. He never complained about receiving nothing for it. That was the epitaph of the Australian SAS in Vietnam. They did what others wouldn't. They survived what others couldn't. And they accepted that history would remember the operations that failed spectacularly while forgetting the operations that succeeded silently. But the soldiers who fought alongside them remembered. The Allied troops, who would have died without the intelligence Australian SAS patrols provided. The commanders who planned defensive operations based on reconnaissance that seemed impossibly detailed. The helicopter pilots who inserted those patrols and somehow extracted them weeks later against odds that shouldn't have permitted survival, they remembered. And occasionally, very occasionally, they spoke, not officially, not for publication, but in the spaces between official histories and classified documents, in the conversations that happen when veterans gather and remember the things that mattered more than medals. The stories persisted. Stories of 5-man patrols that spent 3 weeks inside enemy base areas and never fired a shot. Of observation posts occupied for days while North Vietnamese troops moved past positions close enough to touch. Of psychological operations that broke enemy units without killing a single soldier. Of reconnaissance that made the difference between catastrophic defeat and narrow victory. The missions only the Australians agreed to take. The operations everyone else called suicide. The victories that couldn't be photographed or quantified or celebrated, because acknowledging them would reveal methods that needed to remain classified. This was the real legacy, not what was documented in official histories, what was demonstrated in operational results that couldn't be explained by conventional doctrine, the proof that special operations didn't require special equipment or special technology. They required special soldiers who could transform themselves into what the mission demanded, regardless of cost. The jungle ghosts, the phantoms who operated in silence and received nothing for their effectiveness except the knowledge that they'd mattered when it counted most. The soldiers who took the missions nobody else would take and succeeded where nobody else could succeed, and then went home and never spoke about it again.